Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
A wedding at Mr. Matt's house was bound to make a lasting impression, above all on the owner of the mansion. The best people in town fought for the right to sit at the same table with the most successful man in this part of the globe. A wedding is not only beautiful gifts, a fancy dress, and guest stars. It's also a great opportunity to discuss new contracts and share the next piece of the pie, which economists will then call super profits. Mr. It was enough to snap two fingers and his table was immediately set with the best delicacies and delicacies. And the hearing was complicated by stars and celebrities. George Rossi was in charge of vegetables, the freshest tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers from his greenhouses, herbs, and more. Paul Yanchik claimed to have personally slaughtered a lamb, 2 piglets, and engaged in a real battle with chickens and turkeys. Just enough meat and poultry on the table. Giovanni Greca, he took care of fish and seafood. Salmon, tuna, shrimp, huge lobsters, and other select delicacies. But Luca Moretti and his family prepared a gigantic cake, too much for even this horde of 200 guests. He brought it along with a transparent cooler to the generators and set it up near the main table. Lower-ranking guests provided fresh bread and rolls, salads, appetizers, and other snacks, without which a wedding would never be a celebration. 2 themed areas were set up on the huge lot outside the house. On one performed modern music, on the other retro and classics of Franz Bianca. The most talented sound engineer of our time arranged the musical flows in such a way that they did not overlap. "We Italians have to help each other," smiled Mr. Rinaldi, who was in charge of the groom and the bride's lavish gown. Like jewels or heirlooms, vestments. Here we were, brought in a special box with a microclimate inside. "I am an American," Mr. Moda said loudly, and put the place out of my mind. "I beg your pardon, sir," Rinaldi said ingratiatingly. "I mean, we Americans are supposed to help each other." He had reason to be nervous. Today, the Rinaldi family was to move up one notch. From now on, the hardest part would be his to conquer. Construction contracts on the coast would cover his skyscrapers. Like a palisade here, and there will appear sports arenas, each of which he will keep a small stake in for the sake of management and profit. And his son, will get the most luxurious and richest girl in this part of the earth. "Where is Waska?" Mr. asked unceremoniously. "He's the one who should be standing here like a bayonet, waiting for me to wave. But you know the tradition." Again ingratiatingly looked at the millionaire Rinaldi. "He will come with an orchestra. There will be a beautiful song and then a dance. Even if we have become Americans, that is no reason to forget the music." "Ah, tradition." We muttered that. He wanted this endless day to come to a logical conclusion as quickly as possible. I speaking flippantly to Mr. Rinaldi, the construction magnate. He was only hiding his own insecurities. Monica needs Vacco as much as she needs him. Or rather, it is Mr. to him. She needs this alliance to solidify her position and become all-powerful. The construction empire will take its rightful place in his business package, along with manufacturing, tourism, and gambling. Yes, he is strong and powerful. Without his weighty word, no business is decided in the city. But his own financial strength is disastrously lacking. The Rinaldi family are other wordless toilers. They can cover the whole world with these boring and tasty assignments, which nevertheless are very well worthwhile and sell very well. They have tremendous revolving resources to help make it stronger. "Oh, Rinaldi," said that and clapped his hands loudly. "There's one tradition you and I have forgotten. Let's drink a glass of wine with cheese and meat in honor of our union so that this day will go like clockwork." The groom's father smiled. He was beginning to feel uncomfortable with the nasty mood of it. And then he seemed to feel a little better when he remembered the meat and the wine. As if by magic, a waiter with a huge tray appeared next to them. How did he only hold the enormous thing in his balance, picking out a red dry wine with great aging? Mr. It himself filled 2 glasses to the brim and handed one to Rinaldi. "Let's raise a glass to the fact that our cities are united," suggested the master of the house, and like branches of noble grapes intertwined, and they made a fine wine, which the best houses in the world will chase. Bottoms up. A beautiful toast. Praised Rinaldi. Unlike his opposite, he did not know how to speak beautifully impromptu, preferring to pay money to a professional writer. He had prepared an excellent speech for the ceremony. It is waiting on a clipboard. But he forgot about the welcome toast. And that's all you will say. Surprised. That's how he froze with his glass raised. I want to say, prolonged Rinaldi, and tried to gather his thoughts that you and I children will build the world's tallest skyscraper. Its name is Rinaldi, and on all the floors the lights will always be on for us. Meta touched his expensive glass to a new relative's crockery. The toast was beautiful, but the fact that the family's proud family name was to be relegated to the back burner. Disappointing. It was an issue he'd forgotten to discuss when he was resolving all the formalities surrounding the wedding. Nothing. The grandchildren may well want to carry his last name. Thank goodness it sounds beautiful. Well, Rinaldi, said the master of the house, emptying his glass and snacking on ham. It's about time I checked on our star guests. You haven't forgotten who's going to be performing on our stage tonight, have you? Of course, it would cost a fortune for an outsider to call on so many celebrities. But many of them owed it to Mr. It to start their careers, so they agreed to perform for free, and the millionaire only had to pay for the flight and the hotel. It was already 5 o'clock, and the guests gradually began to arrive. They all approached Mr. Matt, shook his huge, striped palm, and wished the new family well and prosperity. The master of the house wore a luxurious suit, despite the heat, but his broad forehead didn't even show evaporation. What wonderful weather is this? Smiled Mrs. Smith, the wife of the owner of a large retail chain. Matt smiled back specially for you. Thank you for the cheeses you sent to our table. Oh, and it's such a little something. Mrs. Smith waved her hand. You should have seen the gift Angie prepared for our young ones. You'd sign a lifetime contract with us to supply your Italian oils. Mister, it's an exclusive contract. The landlord smiled even wider. But no, he thought haughtily. You can't buy me that cheap. Nata liked full control of the situation, and so every half hour he called his secretary, a charming girl named Anash, and reported whether everything was going according to plan. Chief of Security. Tom reported every hour, reporting any suspicious things. If you see even a shadow, Leet, whispered Mr. Matta, talking to Tom. Nothing and nothing must mar this day. That's right, Mr. Joe, replied the head of security. The situation is under complete control. Mitta was very fond of his faithful guard, who resembled a dog in loyalty. He had an animal-like keen sense of his master. For example, it was he who came up with the idea of changing Giuseppe's name to the American way of Joe. Mr. was very pleased with this. Yes, that's what he began to call himself. The call from Angie came 5 minutes ahead of the control time. Mr. said, the secretary, puzzled. We have a strange guest here. There's one on the list. Roughly, we asked this. Full control, in his opinion, did not involve diving into every detail. But since these nitwits can't do otherwise, no. Anash answered, lowering her voice. Between you and me, it's some kind of ancient old woman. She demands that you come down because of her diction. I can't make out whether she wants to give or take something away. Put her on the phone. Ordered it. Yes, Signora Mr. Giuseppe. The old lady, whose voice was on the other end of the line, came through. Mr. Giuseppe, who am I? Me? The millionaire rang out in his steely voice. I don't recognize you. Measure for measure the lines, the old lady continued in her sweet voice. I happened to find out that there was such a joyful event in your house that I couldn't pass by. You have no idea how far I have come. I came from far away, so we are strangers. Cut off Matta. I am sorry, Signora. But I did not call you to my house this day. I know you did. I know you forgot. The old lady, whose voice on the other end of the wire grew louder and louder. Don't worry, mister, don't worry. I'm not offended. I'm often forgotten now. I need Giuseppe's help. The old woman asked and immediately switched to you. Only you can help me, only you, Giuseppe. Pass the tube back to Signora. Trial of strength. Mr. Joe. On the millionaire's broad forehead appeared out. He didn't sweat at all until he started to get nervous. Mr. Matt made a brief gesture to the waiter, literally one with a Coke. The one, as if reading the big boss's mind, ran up to him and neatly swiped. It was as if the owner of the house wasn't on the phone, but was performing a very complicated operation. He said, "Mother, chase that old woman away. And if she persists, call the police." The sheriff promised me that their car would be hanging around somewhere nearby. But Mr. Joe, outside the territory, Secretary, she says she needs help and that she has important information. I said, "Go ahead," demanded the millionaire, "and don't bother me anymore about such nonsense too. Otherwise, there's a whole line of people who want to take your place." The guests were getting more and more numerous. They were occupying a huge section of Mr. They were touring the lavish interiors of his mansion. They sampled hors d'oeuvres and looked around the table that was set right in the garden. Stylists finished decorating the photo area, and a good dozen photographers walked around the guests so everyone could fill their feed with great shots. Here we need to get to the nicest part of this ceremony. His daughter, his baby girl, is finally going to jump out and get married. We are that furtively wiped a tear from his prickly cheek. Soon enough, he would be babysitting his grandchildren, teaching them to shoot slingshots and kick a soccer ball. The phone rang again. "I told you to chase that damn old lady to hell. Trial and error of strength. Millionaire, Mr. Mehta." Stammering, said the secretary. "There seems to have been an emergency." "What kind of emergency?" Calmly, the head of the family clarified. He was famous for his ability to keep composure in any, even the most difficult situation. A catastrophe. Anash shouted. 3 or 4 hours before his assistant's fateful call, Mr. Ito decided to make sure that both Monica's dress and hair were at the highest level of the ceremony he had organized. The daughter decided well into the guest house, where all her friends were comfortably accommodated. Matt let them walk around all night, and even paid for the food and drinks himself, an unprecedented move on his part, as long as the kids were happy. He explained what he did to the head of security, who was worried about safety. Keeping an eye on them, but through his fingers, the children, most of whom were already close to the 25-year mark. Didn't let them down, didn't break anything, didn't cause the police to be called. And if anyone was doing the domination, it certainly wasn't his daughter, or she did it without anyone noticing. Now there were workers scurrying around the room, ready to go when the young people wanted to go on, hiding from the grown-ups. Very young boys and girls were setting up a slide of glasses, on which champagne would soon flow. And one waiter looked Mr. It straight in the eyes and smiled unceremoniously. Where on earth had he seen him? Ignoring the millionaire's familiarity, he strode to the second floor. He kicked out of his daughter's room hairdresser and makeup artists, asked her girlfriends to leave, then rose from his chair and meticulously examined Monica, trying to find the slightest flaw. But no, everything was perfect. Did his daughter, his pride and joy, really look like the $5-6 million he had invested in this wedding? "Congratulations to you, daughter," he whispered, hugging Monica gently. The main thing was not to wrinkle her dress or damage her makeup. The pictures would grace the main news feeds of the agencies, so they mustn't damage Matt's family credibility. "What's the challenge?" Monica asked. "With being able to tie your business to the Rinaldi family?" Mr. It froze as if struck by thunder. From whom but from his daughter, the smartest and most calculating girl. He hadn't expected to hear anything like that. After all, he had offered her 3 suitors to choose from, and she herself settled on Vasco. The young man, of course, was a bit of a god, and in his Mr. is a presence. He generally swallowed his tongue like a snake. But all in all a great guy, and he certainly loved her dearly. Yeah, the guy was a wuss. But that's the kind of guy Monica wanted. More importantly, with the financial ability to satisfy all her needs, which can grow over the years. "What do you mean by that?" my father asked. "What I mean is, shut up." Suddenly Mr. shouted, "I don't even want to hear it. Any girl in your place would be dancing for joy. And you're just turning your nose up at me like you always do. And why do you never want to hear me?" Monica asked, and there were tears in her eyes, "Everything I do for you and for the family," answered Mr. It's trying to give his capital voice a softness. You should be grateful to me. You know that Vasquez is not the hero of my novel, Monica sighed. Yes, we'll settle it well. He loves me. He was very gentle with me. But to live with him all my life, I would die of homesickness. Mister, it came to a head. On a day like this, of course, he shouldn't have upset his daughter unnecessarily. She would marry Vasco anyway. It was a done deal. But all her life, she would remember his pressure and despotism, which means she'll hate him. It was necessary to sweeten the pill. Fortunately, he had already been concerned about it a month ago and had prepared a gift that would make any girl soar to the seventh heaven with delight. Forgive me, darling, forgive my pressure and my arrogant tone. You know how difficult it is to make these decisions, but I'm the one who's fully responsible for them. Here you go. We said it as we held out the ring to our daughter. I have a present for you. What is it? Asked the bride. It is a true relic, the father said enthusiastically. Can you believe that this trinket was worn by the wife of the first president of this glorious country? Monica stared at the ring. It did look beautiful, but was it really worth spending a lot of money on something like that? The girl imagined how her father's men had obtained it, maybe stolen from a museum. And if not, she didn't want to think about it. To wear it with pride. Solemnly, we said it. It was a gift from me personally. And don't forget for a second, dear, that we are Americans with an Italian surname, sarcastically said Monica. What's the point of that? Are we Italian, American, or Jewish? What's the difference? How dare you? Matta got indignant. My parents and I have put up with bullying and abuse all our lives just so you could be a representative of this God-chosen nation. And without my last name, no important issue is decided in this city. Isn't that God's providence? I've told you 100 times, I'm not interested. Monica snapped back. I just want to make my music. You hear? She was talking about her stupid songs again. Joe had already cursed the day so many years ago when he had given his daughter a guitar and taught her a few chords. Yes, she sang great, but he saw her as a financier with brains like hers. She could multiply the family fortune by a factor of 10 or 20. What was waiting for her on the stage? First, you have to invest a whole ton of money without any guarantee of return. A star's career lasts 5 or 10 years. And then what? But no, you can't risk it. I am an American, though. We said it formidably, losing control of ourselves. But I might as well take an Italian whip and tap dance on your international ass. Sorry, Poe. Monica answered immediately, who understood the reality of such threats. The best people in the city and the country are doing your wedding. I couldn't settle down. Millionaire, would you be so kind as to at least smile? Keep your thoughts to yourself. What's gotten into you today anyway? Because I'm in love with someone else. Monica explained. Who? Mr. Matt asked. He was going to explain to her that you can live with one person and love another. The main thing was to do it carefully, so as not to foster rumors and speculation. And as soon as Monica opened her mouth, the phone rang. Tony Class, the eccentric billionaire on whom Mr. Joe had pinned special hopes, had arrived. Not a word. Asked for it, raising his hand. I love you, daughter, Mr. Tony, said the owner of the family in the kindest tone of voice his speech apparatus was capable of. What an honor and surprise. I am on my way to you. The guests have arrived. The tables are overflowing with refreshments, and the musicians on both stages continue to fill the air with beautiful melodies. However, Monica is missing, and there is no clarity about her disappearance. The saddest part is that no one saw where she went, not her stylist, not her makeup artist, not her girlfriends. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Mr. was faced with the dilemma of canceling the wedding or hoping that Monica's kidnapping was someone else's bad joke. Santi, her best friend, was crying, clutching a teddy bear in her hands, and for some reason she was feeding herself for what had happened. The local police office sent 2 detectives at once to speed up the investigation. The gentleman was taken to task for this. His weight was too high. Tell me again, asked one detective, tall, thin, turning to Santa. Only without the tears. Honey, what happened? Musicians in traditional Mexican attire entered the guest house. Sobbing, she said, "I don't know who commissioned them. They started playing their songs, doing round dances with us. When I came to, I saw that Monica was nowhere to be found. And I sounded the alarm." How long did the singing, dancing, and tequila destroying go on? The tall detective clarified. "I don't even know. Stretched out to Santa. Maybe 20 minutes. Or more." "When was the last time you saw Monica?" Santee looked expressively at Matt, tearing up again. "When her dad, Mr. Joe came in and kicked us out," she said. "And that was before the Mexican band." "Maybe she went somewhere?" asked the second detective, the low, fat one. His appearance was so unhappy that it made Mr. It wanted to give him 105 to lift his spirits a little. The phone was left on the bed, claimed with renewed vigor to Santa. After all, she doesn't go anywhere without her phone. The two guards on duty outside the guest house saw nothing suspicious. They questioned all the youth and waiters on behalf of Mr. It, compiling explanatory notes on behalf of each. But where had his daughter gone? In her luxurious dress, no one noticed. Now the short, fat detective was flicking through the notes, and his disgruntled look was growing darker. At one point, the policemen looked at each other and took their positions beside Mr. "This case is crap," said the disgruntled cop of short stature. "If it's a kidnapping, it's masterfully played. As they say, hats off. Do you think it's funny?" asked the millionaire Mr. Joe. "If it is still a crime, do you have any enemies? Do you have any enemies? Do you have any idea who might have kidnapped her?" asked the thin and tall detective Stanley, thoughtfully biting his pencil. "Who?" Mr. Mota roared. "Yes, any cretin who has a desire to become $1 million, or two richer, or whatever it is that kidnappers, daughters, millionaires usually demand. Have you had any demands made yet?" Detective Brandon clarified. This bigwig with the loud voice was beginning to annoy him. So was the whole gathering of similarly self-righteous jackasses. A gathering in his precinct. No, none at all. Stretched out Matt. The groom was murdered. The cops looked at each other. "Do we have a murder?" asked Stanley. No, the millionaire hobbit waved his hands morally. "He loves my daughter very much. Was it really painful to look at you?" He sobbed like a girl, trying to tell his side of the story. They had been dating for 6 months, but they had slept together only a handful of times. And it wasn't because of her Italian upbringing, but because of Monica's disgusting character. We knew that American women had a different attitude toward a flat relationship than Italian women. Sleeping with 2 or 3 guys before marriage in the U.S. equated to the total preservation of innocence. And his daughter was so caught up in the local tradition that she could pass for a Native American in terms of sexual freedom. But she preferred to keep you on starvation rations. It was an approach he understood and even shared. Detective Brendan looked out the second-floor window of the guest house. The view of the courtyard was spectacular. Beautiful music was playing, something like country music. The blue pool rippled in the sunlight. Now I wish I could throw off my jacket, shirt, and pants and dive into that sinful water and call for a waiter with an ice-cold drink. His partner stood beside him and looked out over the courtyard, too. They had been together so long that they had learned to read each other's minds. It struck them both that a girl with a short haircut, dressed in black slacks and a white blouse, was bustling about the yard. She was only rushing to one guest, who was to another. As she explained something to them, the detectives looked at each other. "This is your secretary, Mr. Joe," asked Stanley, pointing to the agile girl. The secretary about it, he hated having all those suffixes and endings added to normal male occupations. "And don't you dare say feminism in my house." Stanley was silent. Oh, those rich people, thought the detective. Their quirks. She was the one who sounded the alarm. "So invite her here," asked Brenton. "And please, let us not waste our time on the subtleties of the English language. We detectives mostly use a non-printed version of it, but we don't brag about it on every corner." The guests had no idea that this was an emergency at the multimillionaire's house. The music kept playing, the photographers kept filming the crowd, and the animators kept entertaining them. Waiters passed cold drinks and snacks. However, these people are not fooled. Successful people have a kind of sixth sense, which tells them the right decision. The richest and most influential started to get nervous, stuck here in the sun all day. That wasn't part of their plan. Tony Case, the eccentric inventor and billionaire, was already twittering about it. It's after 12 o'clock. The young ones are still gone. Was he writing, "Will there be a wedding today? Will there be a wedding today?" Or is it about a grand dress rehearsal, a word to the press? Shouted Tony, calling up the receptionist. That's my joy. What's all the slowing down about? I love tedious waiting, but today it was too tedious. And Mr. Tony shrugged her shoulders. There's such a thing, such a thing. A life-saving phone call. Mr. It barked into the phone to get her up to the second floor of the guest house right away. Angie smiled once more at Kaiza, promised to sort it all out, and rushed to her patron. Although the girl was not in charge of security and was the first to sound the alarm, she still felt a pang of guilt. To think that Monica was missing. This is the most charming and intelligent girl. Her worst competitors in the fight and for brains. The attention of her bitterest rival in the battle for minds is as if it had dissolved. Mr. Joe, she shouted. What should we do, Mr. Joe? First, calm down. Said it in her steely voice. Secondly, listen to these gentlemen. I'm going to call a council and decide what to do about the wedding. The millionaire went into the next room and picked up the telephone. His active soul wanted to move, to understand, to find out. But he knew absolutely nothing about police work. On the contrary, he had always shunned meetings with officers of law. Of course, he had something to hide from the representatives of the law and the authorities. But now, alas, there was nowhere without them. We'll have to put up with it. It's a tiresome neighborhood. Shall we split up? Brandon suggested. You continue to stay with the guests, and I'll start watching the video. I bet. We'll find the answers to any questions on those videos. Stanley nodded his mind. Renton's mind is set up in such a way that he is better able to work with a vast array of information. Where the average man would have a stupor, this full-fledged detective showed wonders of ingenuity. The detective went into the adjoining room, where there was a high table, and began laying out his gadgets. Great idea, Stanley said. He was left to have a conversation with the secretary of the Fatso. To the tall Stanley, the huge leather couch was just right. His feet stood on the ground while he leaned on the backrest, a position in which to sit for a Russian was true bliss. The detective felt that this young beauty with a short haircut could definitely be useful to him. But in what way? My name is Stanley, he told the girl, Detective Stanley. We're investigating Monica's kidnapping this. Simple, she replied. Call me. Angela, what a rare name, smiled Stan. But the girl didn't react at all. So you were the first to sound the alarm. My partner and I saw through the window how you were literally calming the neighborhood and probably saw all the guests. We did, answered the girl. The maitre ordered me to check everyone personally. Checked, the detective clarified. At the entrance, I explained that the invitation coincides with the list. He's a sexist, in a good way. Guests don't like all those guards he's coveting. A young girl is another matter. So there you go, Stanley interrupted her. Did you see anything suspicious? Maybe some plumbers or supposedly police officers came in. The bridesmaid says there was a Mexican concert. That's the plan, she said. I've already given the band's contacts to the security guard. We booked the Mexicans a month ago. The girl thought there was more on the program. She almost cried. Illusionist. 2 Hollywood actors with small performances, a couple of world stars. It's a shame that all her work went to waste. Though, of course, other people were in charge of the organization. Then maybe, the detective stretched out. Maybe you just want to tell me something. Not necessarily something suspicious, something that would help the investigation. Water. Nodded her head. I have something to say, just not here. Let's get away from him. Away from who? The detective was surprised by John. He nodded expressively toward the room where we were to gather our counsel to. Yes, I whispered. At this time, the master of the mansion was indeed preparing to hold a meeting. In any unclear situation, he would hold an extended gathering. So how was kidnapping his daughter any worse? The mother then called his deputies, who were also present at Mr. Rinaldi's wedding. Then he thought about it and decided to go to extreme measures, even summoning his own wife. Who had I forgotten? Got mad about it. And at that very second, his expensive phone rang. Mr. Joe, Diego Maradona is here, the head of security reported. Where are we taking him? Do you even know what happened? Mata yelled. Yes, without the slightest embarrassment, Tom replied. There were rumors that he was dead. But that's Maradona. How could he miss your daughter's wedding? Tom shouted, "We are my daughter is missing. Surprised the chief of security. Where to, Mr. Joe? I have no idea. The millionaire roared. My daughter's gone. And you're fired? Go the hell out there. Brandon hated working in such an environment of huge numbers of people, but most importantly, the snacks and booze that literally dotted everything around him. Also, beautiful girls rewarding him with long, piercing stares. The detective yelled at a dozen guests of the employees, while he managed to pull himself together. He withdrew to his hard drive, video recordings, photos labeled who and which ones he had provided him. In the meantime, a siege plan was in effect throughout the city. Dozens of cops were searching cars, combing train stations and airports. Bullshit. He'd investigated a dozen kidnappings in his career. Criminals always made the same mistake. They talked too much, so they left a trail, brands, like dogs. The only thing left to do was to get a whiff of that smell and get a lead on the intruders. Stanley said excitedly, dialing his partner. I think I found it. Got something. Hear that? Let's talk to that uncle again. In the early days of his career, Brandon remembered his own cases in great detail. Even a month or two later, he could tell any case, quote transcripts of interrogations and expert opinions. But gradually, the cases became similar to each other. In recent years, he already had difficulty recalling the details of the solved crimes. And of all the kidnappings, he could recall only one that ended in a major failure. However, it wasn't his fault that it happened. After all, the boy's parents did not want to go to the police until the last minute. Brenda began looking for the intruders only on the third day of the kidnapping, and all he found was a breathless body. Look, Brendan said, setting the clipboard in front of Matt and Stanley, who arrived 5 minutes later. I took a quick look at the video footage. So our little girl went missing between 17 to 30 hours. Let's just say he grumbled it out. He suddenly felt old and also devilishly tired. So what? Do you know why I thought so? Asked the detective, because at 4:45 p.m. your daughter was caught in the lens of a girlfriend. They were taking selfies. That coincides with an explanation of how her march was. And around 6:00 p.m., you grabbed her missing. Half an hour later, we pulled up. What did the millionaire say next? Do you want to brag that you can do your job a little bit? Not at all, Brandon smiled. I asked you to come here for a minute for a very different reason. My question is this. Who did the dress? Why did that question come up in the first place? Brendan was angry. It's a silly question. All the way I like it. We're just wasting our time arguing. Said the detective, but I was going to show it anyway. Look, don't you find anything strange? Brandon pressed the spacebar and the laptop started playing the video from the security camera outside the guest house. It showed a waiter pushing in front of him the very box in which the bride's dress had been delivered. At one point he looked away, and the Raven detective pressed stop. The face, of course, was problematic to see, but some features could be caught. Stanley took a picture of the screen on his phone and stepped aside to send out an orientation. By a strange coincidence, the other cameras in our hero's path didn't work. Said Brandon, I told the interrogator to go all the way through. He says there's a fire entrance. It's all paved with paving stones. There's no footprints. It's hard to tell whether someone opened the lock or not. Forensics already took samples, see if there's any trace left, but I'm guessing this is the waiter who rolled out the box. It's all right. Mr. Joe. He was absorbed in his monologue and did not notice how pale his companion turned. The millionaire continued to stare at the still frame. He must have listened to the fiery speech too, immersed in his own thoughts. It could not be. Mata whispered, clenching his fists. He felt his head start to spin, as if the car under his control had flipped over and was flying into an abyss. It couldn't be. "Do you know who that is?" asked Stanley. He watched the millionaire carefully. He was also digesting the information he had received 5 minutes ago from Angie. He also barked it out. "My girl is in mortal danger, detectives. I bet it was my nephew who cut these." Stanley had been working for the last few months. He was already determined to quit the force. Even though he was only 37 years old, he was fed up. His young children were growing up completely autonomous, communicating with their father by telephone and correspondence. His wife used to make scandals almost every day. And at work, the big bosses slapped him on the shoulders and asked him to stay on for another year. Better yet, 5 years. Richard Stanley told the chief of police, hesitant to sign a report of dismissal. "You're good, you're damn good. Who needs you but us, dear family?" answered the detective. Stanley had already decided for himself that as soon as he found the daughter of the bigwigs would immediately go on leave and start looking for work, and he won't go back to the police station. After all, is it his fault that there is so much crime in this city and so few cops who can investigate it quickly and properly? "And do you like your job?" asked the detective, as they walked down the corridors of the guest house. "Yes," smiled the girl. "It is the best job on earth, but I can't find a man. Or at least a guy Mr. It's got, a bad reputation in that regard. Right this way." She opened the door and gestured for me to come inside. She looked carefully to make sure there were no intruders. Everything was in order. This is where the mops were put. Buckets here stored sponges and other things needed to get things in order. The room had the smell of a cleaner, which the detective really liked. 2 days ago, strange people came to see Mr. This said, when they were alone in the room on the first floor. The room was cramped and there was absolutely nowhere to sit. "If he finds out I told you, he'll be furious, detective. He'll definitely fire me." "You hear that? Where did you go?" Stanley asked. "His house." "No. We started again with our heads. They didn't go into the house." He talked to them at the guard post. And then one of the guys told me that Mr. Joe pulled out a whole wad of money and shoved it in their hands. "You think so?" asked the detective. "Do you think he's hiding something?" "Yes, definitely." The girl nodded. "He knows more than we do." "And Monica also didn't want this wedding. She told you herself." Stanley wondered. "No, we weren't friends. She used to be very jealous of her father. She even threw a couple of tantrums, said we spent too much time together, even alone." "And what's that?" Laughing. The girl shrugged her shoulders. "He generally likes even his daughters to fight for him. By his own aides. So what makes you think Monica didn't want a wedding?" asked Stanley. "She had a lover." The girl answered. "I can tell you something, if it stays between us." "You have my word," Stanley nodded. "Tom was looking out for her at my request," the girl said. "Monica was meeting this guy at an apartment in town. He might know the address." Stanley thought such an outcome would be most curious. The girl had set up her own kidnapping to get money out of her father. But no, too complicated. And it's obviously not the right day. No, all girls want to get married, even when it comes to the daughters of millionaires. And this pretty girl is probably just jealous of the girl and wants to do everything she can not to be found. "Is that it?" asked Stanley. "I think this information will help the investigation." "I can go," she asked. "I think we've made up our minds about the wedding. And I have to go back to him to be near him and do as he says." Suddenly, Arsh moved abruptly closer to the detective, took him by the hem of his jacket, leaned toward him, and kissed him gently on the lips and smiled. "You're all right," she said playfully, and left the room. Stanley was faced with a different challenge. Renee was literally bursting with pride in her own persona. To pull off such a thing all by himself. Of course, he had the help of his brother Jerome, who had helped arrange for him to be a waiter at this lavish wedding and had provided false papers. He hated the Matt family, so he was happy to mess with them. But could Jerome have imagined his brother would risk such an affair? Ring was also backed by his cousin Giovanni. He was the one who had helped push the heavy box into his van and was now driving it to the hiding place. But the rest was a solo composition. sung by Reen in proud solitude. From pleasure and joy, he hummed an old Italian song, and Giovanni immediately backed him up with his powerful voice. Without taking his eyes off the road, Reen asked. He couldn't stand it. "What's in there?" With a gasp, asked Giovanni. "Oh, 45 kilograms of pure gold," smiled Reen. He had a reputation for being a joker and a jester. So the cousin wrote what he said in a sense of humor. "I hope you know what you're doing," said Giovanni, "because I'd hate to go back to prison." "Don't worry," pronounced Rene. "When are you going to find out what kind of scam I pulled? You'll be over the moon. And your young brother will never give you up for life. You know I'm a rock." Besides not being a joker, we all knew about his strong-willed Italian character. Indeed, if he decided to keep quiet, the whole police force of the world would not be able to get a word out of him. That is why Giovanni decided to help his brother. Besides, if the cops came after him, he could always pretend to be a hoser and pretend he didn't understand the complaint at all. "Do you really want to know what's in there?" Rene suddenly asked. "No, I've changed my mind." Laughter. "In case Hawaii catches up with me and I don't know anything." After a year in jail, Giovanni promised himself and his mother to give up crime. He bought an old bus and ran a trucking business. The guy loved to work and was ready to spend 14 o'clock a day at the wheel, which is not typical for Italians. But alas, after a staggering amount of criminal money, his income promised little. He could even live behind the wheel of his bus, sleep there, and take any job he wanted. It would still only be enough to make ends meet. And for an hour's ride, Rene had given him 300, and the joker clearly had more work in store. "If you're really careful, there's no way they'll get caught." "Listen, listen," Joe said, not taking his eyes off the road. "Maybe you got a theme in mind. We could play together and make a big score." "But no," Brother Balaguer answered, and pointed to an inconspicuous driveway in the garages. "Crime is not for me. Turning here. You know I have a singing career ahead of me. Pretty soon the whole coast will be talking about me. You'll see and you'll hear." And he sang another song in his velvet voice. Giovanni envied this young artist. He was really good. And how did he feel about the guitar? Could it be that he really decided to put it out there for the old men to go on stage? Why wouldn't he? It's said that all the more or less big American stars used to be backed by the Italian mafia. Together they gave a guy. They unloaded a large, human-sized briefcase and rolled it carefully into a corner of the garage. The guy hugged Giuseppe tightly and gave him a brotherly kiss on both cheeks. The driver wiped away the tear that had appeared in his mouth, waved goodbye, and sent him away. When he drove 100 yards away, he remembered, jumped out of the cab and returned the real license plates, and rolled up the stolen ones he had been driving with into a ram's horn and shoved them under the eastern chimney. No dog would ever find it. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Mr. Matta had no rest. To think of his nephew cutting to go, sneaking into his wedding. He also rolled out a case for a personal dress, probably along with his daughter. There's one question inside, though, that hasn't gone anywhere. How did he get her inside? Monica had to fight back. It would have taken a whole gang of kidnappers to break her resistance. How did this young cut these? Carried out such a daring plan alone? No, whispered it while pouring whiskey into a huge glass. No, he has accomplices. I will find them, and I will make them talk. Whatever it takes. So, Mr. Rinaldi, Stanley said, looking at the groom's father. Look closely at this picture. Do you recognize anyone? The detective showed him an image taken from Brendan's laptop. The interlocutor looked carefully at the screen inside. I told you, I spoke with anger, whispered Rinaldi. Let's hire professionals. Let's spend on security. Let's not waste any time. Stanley asked Monica. It was probably kidnapped. That's as good as it gets, said Rinaldi. If it's a detective's case, I recognize the valise. It always delivered a dress for our princess. Tell me more about it, asked Stanley. It's quite an expensive dress, the groom's father explained. It needs a special humidity and temperature. This case maintains it. Well, sort of like a refrigerator. Could a person fit inside? I think so, said Rinaldi. especially if you're talking about a skinny girl. Can you adjust the temperature? Asked Stanley. Sure, nodded the father of the groom, and the humidity. The detective scratched his chin thoughtfully. In another situation, he would have assumed that Rinaldi was involved in the kidnapping. But he had absolutely no motive to commit this crime. Now he and his frustrated brother-in-law were exposed to ridicule. Let me ask you a personal question, Stanley said. Suppose I'm a kidnapper and I want to set a ransom for Matt's daughter. How much should I ask for? Between you and me, he's not doing very well, Rinaldi said. He's rich in assets, but to pull any large sum out of it overnight, I don't think he could pull more than 10 million. Who do you think would want to kidnap the girl? Asked the detective. I do not know. Rinaldi shrugged his shoulders. One thing's for sure, if he hadn't thought he was smarter than the rest of us put together, it wouldn't have happened. Anger, longing filled his soul. Rinaldi didn't feel sorry for the $1 million he'd spent on the wedding, and even the lavish dress for Monica, which she clearly didn't deserve, didn't bother him at all. Reputation was another matter. If this trickster didn't figure out how to get out of the situation, he needed to be distanced from him immediately. Rinaldi could not believe that such a thing was possible in modern America. It seemed that the era of Italian strife was a thing of the past. Even his father was no more than a respectable American, let alone his son. Vasca, in this situation, held his own. He was, of course, discouraged by the news of the kidnapping of his bride. But he didn't lose his spirits. Detective, Rinaldi asked, let me ask you a question. What are the odds that our beauty will be found alive and of course? Well, a kidnapping is usually solved within 3 days, Stanley explained. The next milestone is a week. If they don't find the person in that period, the chances of rescue are close to zero. But excuse me, said Rinaldi. You said but. Yes, nodded the detective. If we are talking about classic kidnappings, but there's a nuance. Nepper makes his claims within 24 hours or immediately after the crime. And there's silence here. It is strange. Looking at the general gaiety, it brought tears to my eyes. Annoyed, he went out to the crowd. After a brief meeting with his assistants and his wife, he made a decision, and yet he was terribly reluctant to voice it. As much as Mr. Joni delayed this moment, we must act. The musicians stopped playing music, all eyes fixed on him, the master of the house. Taking the microphone from the host's hands, he exhaled loudly and said, Dear guests, my beloved near and dear ones. Unfortunately, disaster has come to this house instead of a wedding. There was a murmur across the courtyard. It was not only the guests who spoke, but the waiters as well. Some impressionable woman collapsed and her clumsy husband accidentally broke an expensive champagne flute. My daughter Monica, Nestor whispered. It disappeared just like that, without explanation. The police are already working here at the mansion. If any of you have any questions, please don't deny me the courtesy of answering. Maybe it would save my little girl's life. Yes, God bless you all. The landlord's words had the effect of exploding a bomb. Dozens of people streamed out. She used to try to sift out the most high-status and expensive guests, to take them out separately. She tossed around in the crowd, which was becoming less and less organized. Some stepped aside to let the flow pass them. But the lyricists were triumphant, getting new information on their phones. What started out as a dreary wedding of millionaires risked turning into a swanky reportage on the 100th anniversary story. Basically, she didn't care about Monica's fate if she was raped or killed. It would only spice things up. Of course, she couldn't say such things out loud. But no one forbade her from thinking the redemptive thought. This story would help her soar to the top of journalistic Olympus. To gain a foothold in the profession, her human response helped her. She instantly turned on the photo and video cameras on her phone and instantly printed the news. So now her journalistic instincts and a little bit of prompting helped her make the only right decision. Going to the party under the guise of a photographer, she took great pictures and completely unpunished. Now she had to make the right choice. She would be better off hiding in a mansion, listening, and then making a recording. She'd spotted the cops with her keen eye before. Both Brandon and Stanley were familiar to her. Now the master of the house had to communicate with the guests again, but this time to accept from them endless wishes for support and offers of help. BSCELED and devastated. We shook every hand and endured, every touch on his shoulder. The very last person in this mournful procession was the groom's father. But Mr. Joe heard no words of encouragement from him. If the security in this house is at such a low level, Mr. Rinaldi pronounced, when no one else is around, should we think about the unity of our capitals? What on earth are you talking about? Nat's gruff voice was worn to a powerful rebuke. I'm doing everything in my power to find Monica. They think she might have faked her own kidnapping, said the unfortunate relative. He says she wasn't sure of her feelings. How dare he? Mr. Mata shouted. My daughter is the smartest and most beautiful girl. She adores her father and so do you. She wouldn't talk such nonsense. That's what I told him, Rinaldi replied. But the smile on his face didn't please Mr. Joe. Did you also explain to the boy what it means to fix the losses? Fix the losses. The millionaire asked the question mechanically. Although he was well aware of such a phrase, how to fix it? Yes, Rinaldi nodded. He no longer had that ingratiating tone. There was more confidence too. Kid, unlike us, Mr. Joe never went through bankruptcy. That feeling of emptiness when you realize you've been left with nothing. But you and I have been through it. Monica is probably his first big loss. I explained to the guy that he needed to come to terms with it. Listen to Rinaldi. Mr. Mata grabbed his vis-a-vis by the jacket. We'll find her tomorrow, the day after tomorrow at the latest, and play the damn wedding. Izzy, we build the whole coast with your skyscrapers. Do you hear Giuseppe? Rinaldi said softly, pulling away. I said I'm fixing the losses with my baby. He has fully accepted our renewed strategy. Together we're going to open up new markets. Nothing personal, just business. Of course, with your capabilities, we could accomplish a lot. And so could you with our hands. But there's Providence and there's the voice of God. On the coast, our wedding whispered it. The coast is not the end of the world. The construction magnate said in a conciliatory tone. We can do anything. I've been ready to switch to building a subway or social housing in Mexico, or building an individual bomb shelter for a long time now. They say there's a huge demand for them now, like during the Cold War. Do you really think I'm doing all this for the growth of an empire? Don't you? The master of the house was surprised. Not at all. Rinaldi answered. I just wanted my boy Vasco to be happy. Bless you, Giuseppe. I'm sure your daughter will come back. Are you sure you can get her married? Profitable. But another time, perhaps I should ask her consent. The millionaire was utterly mortified. The guests, who only hours before had been ready to drink and eat from his hands, were leaving the mansion. Along with them, his soul was being filled. A vague sense of unease. The last time he had defended it was in 2008, a few hours before the start of the mortgage default. Fortunately, he was able to survive that crisis through an extremely broad portfolio of investments. But was that pang of fear that had come over his soul? Now, sitting in the closet was uncomfortable. River was glad he hadn't been tempted to try all the dozens of wines and other drinks the ceremony tables were bursting with. Once inside the guest house, she chose the right room and decided to hide there. Finding it wasn't easy, but landmarks helped. 20 minutes later, she heard familiar voices. She did. The detectives and I were discussing the missing daughter. Rika furtively turned on the recorder and prepared to listen. One last conversation, and we'll leave you, Stanley said. You see, we can't get rid of the feeling that there's some other factor. Did Brandon help him, which you either conceal from us or consider irrelevant? I told you where to look for her. Martha roared. Don't you see who's making my whole life go to hell? We can't break into Mr. Stanley said calmly. Even if his nephew was here. Even if he stole the dress case. Besides, Rinaldi had made no claim to the thing. Moreover, said Brenton, it might well have been a diversion. But agree, who would draw so much attention to themselves by stealing such a huge structure? It showed up on his forehead again. Those cheeks had already figured out everything, right down to who the ill-fated case belonged to. I wish they'd been as quick as they were looking for his daughter. He himself, though, couldn't stand anyone teaching him how to work. Who knows? Isn't the esteemed cop as sentimental about these matters as he is? Let's try to remember, said Detective Stanley in his calm voice. Was there anything strange about the day your daughter went missing, or in the days before? Strange. Prolonged. There was. There was some old lady who came by today. Brandon was surprised. What's so strange about it? She was talking, saying she had some information for me, and she asked for help, told me to come down. And what did she say? Asked the detective. I have no idea. The millionaire shrugged his shoulders. I told her to get the hell out of here. You didn't remember her name, of course, said the cop. Why not? It was desperately in need of praise, as in the old days when his every silly joke was greeted with loud laughter. I keep hundreds of names and numbers in my head. Detective, so name it. The name that was just on the tip of my tongue is slipping away. The millionaire began snapping his fingers, as if trying to catch the running words by the tail. What the hell was his name? I've heard that name before. Frustrated detective tired to wait for the resurrection of the cherished name in the memory, and was about to leave the room with a colleague. But in the doorway we had called them both. He remembered. Excitedly whispered the millionaire. Her name was Mara for the line. That's how she introduced herself when we talked on the phone, and Anash dialed for me. It was about 4:30 p.m., gentlemen. You see, I'm not that old yet. That's for sure, Brandon asked, scratching his chin. Is there any confusion? No. Evil answered we did. I told you, I have an excellent memory. You wanted details. I remembered them. The thing is, said Brandon, I know this woman, or rather these details. Well, dig, Inspector, dig. Vizjo shouted. Dig in that direction. Mr. Mehta, tell me honestly, are you taking the piss? The journalist became alarmed. The names and surnames spoken up to that moment did not say exactly nothing. But when she heard the prize Pasolini, the journalist perked up. Could she be the one? Taking out Rick's iPhone, she began to scribble a short note tack sketch. If now suddenly her hunch is confirmed, no. She shouldn't ask so much of fate. Fortune loves preparation, of course, but also stamina and modesty, the very qualities that Rika could never boast of. The telephone, a journalist's main weapon. River thought, trying to stretch her legs. All there are cameras to take cool pictures. A notepad to quickly type in the memo you need. And then there's the internet, where you can always snatch up the information you need. If I didn't know your boss, Mata roared, I'd call you a puppy, for no one is allowed to hear you. No one is allowed to say in my house that I'm bullying. If you're not bullying, that's even worse. The detective muttered. Brendan held back, but with great difficulty. To gain access to Signora, Ruin, really had to dig. In the truest sense of the word. All because her funeral was 3 weeks ago. Grandma had passed away, quietly and peacefully. What could not be said for the valuables that were stored in her vintage apartment? While the old lady waited for her own nameless body to be discovered, someone took out everything they could get their hands on. Brandon was on duty when the call came in. This was neither his level nor his specialty. After all, burglaries can be handled by rookie cops. They could be investigated by trackers with good agents or serious leads. The brand had a non-trivial reason for such a case in the works. One of the things that was stolen from the old lady was a real relic. You see, Mr. Mehta, said the detective, I don't believe in coincidences. And there are so many in this case it just makes me sick. Do you know who the measure is? Of course I don't. The millionaire waved his hand, just remembered the name. And that was the name of the grandmother who wanted to see me this morning. What's the matter? You don't see, the world is behind the lines. Passed away some time ago. The old lady was well-to-do, explained the detective. She owned a Martha Washington ring. Quite officially. What's wrong? Are you sick? No, Mr. answered it paler. There's nothing wrong. These worries are about my daughter, and not only that. So talk to that poor collector. You see, Martha Washington's ring is a real relic, said Brandon. Oh, come on, I'm sorry. It's a waste of time. We have work to do. Let's go to the walls. No, I don't think so. Tell me, the millionaire asked. It's very interesting. What's the matter with this unfortunate ring? All right, it won't take long anyway. Brandon waved his hand. That ring is worth an insane amount of money. The entire state police force is focused on finding it. Shortly before the mayor's death, the line was going to donate it to the National Museum. There was a long negotiation, but alas. And what would face the man who stole such a ring? We asked this in as calm a voice as possible. I do not know. For sure, Brendan shrugged. I guess the kidnappers just don't realize what a treasure has fallen into his dirty clutches. You see, a trinket like that might be worth 1 million and 10 or 20. Yeah, you could get killed for that. Mister, that's too bad for you. The millionaire collapsed on the floor of Stanley, who until now had remained silent. Ran up to the millionaire and grabbed him by the shoulders. Took his pulse. Everything was normal. The cops looked at each other. Mr. Jones sat up, rubbing his temples. We need to talk, whispered Mata. There's no time to talk to my lawyer, Brandon said rudely. This is about your daughter's life. If you have something to say, spit it out right now. I saw the ring, said the millionaire. He was frightened that he had brought his daughter to the brink of death himself. Detective Brandon wondered. When I bought that ring, whispered Mata. I bought it. But I had no idea it was stolen. I had no idea. So why did you buy it? Asked the cop. Don't you understand? The millionaire waved his hand. If you were like me and my parents have been in the skin of a migrant. When I got my American passport, I swore that I would never leave this country and that I would never give it up. And the ring of the wife of the first president, Hugo. Stanley smiled. And those, shall we say, antiques buffs knew what they were selling you. Yes, they did. Mata shrugged his shoulders. Oh, shit. I was the one who told them I was going to give my daughter a present. The detectives looked at each other. Stanley pulled out his phone and started frantically typing something into a messenger. Brandon froze like a dog. He turned his head left and right. Then he signaled to his colleague to freeze. Quietly, slowly, Brandon walked over to the new closet, swung it open. What a meeting, said the girl, looking at the millionaire, pleased to meet him. And here I am, hiding from the annoying attention of my employer. You, who are you? This roared as he approached her. I'll throw you out the window. Don't touch her, Mr. Joe, warned Stanley, grabbing the landlord by the arm. She's a journalist. Worked a millionaire. But give me the phone. Late is late. The girl smiled, showing her iPhone. It's too late. After all, I had already sent a note. God bless America. This time Mr. John did not collapse to the floor, but his face became so pale that you could see the vascular patterns on it. America only smiled as she watched him suffer. She loved watching the masters of life suffer. Brandon hated the press. But it was he who was sent to vent in front of journalists, and he dared not disobey orders. You have to be careful when talking to the media. Even if you're going to leave the force, you've got to be careful if you want to stay on the force. Just one wrong word, one joke, and the newspapermen will instantly raise your detective soul to their free speech pitchforks. Dear colleagues, said Brandon, I am invited to make a brief statement. The police are investigating Monica's disappearance. This means a criminal trial. An enormous amount of evidence has been analyzed. The department is willing to pay a reward to anyone who has information of value to us. Have the kidnappers made demands? A young journalist asked. She did not identify herself. No demands, the detective replied. And there is no reliable information about the details of the kidnapping. If not a kidnapping, what then? Asked the Tolstoy newspaperman, twitching all his chin. No comment. Brandon answered. He loved that word combination. Suppose I am a kidnapper. The young journalist said thoughtfully. What would I get? For leniency, if you surrender from the police and fulfill all her requirements, said the detective with a smile. What was happening was beginning to annoy him. More questions. Mr. Brandon, he heard a familiar voice. Rick Smith is a special correspondent. Do you confirm that there has also been a theft of a national relic of Martha Washington's ring? Affirmative. Brandon nodded. Just don't sensationalize it. That ring was stolen 3 weeks ago. I personally put the card in the treasure hunt system. Its cultural status is also unconfirmed, since it wasn't examined by an expert. The rest is just coincidence and your speculation. The detective immediately invited language, but it was too late. The reporters perked up like an alligator being tossed a piece of meat. He saw the newspapermen rushing to their gadgets to scribble notes. It was a joke that not only a millionaire's daughter was missing, but also a very valuable gizmo. Was Mr. Matta involved in the disappearance of this ring? Asked Royka. In the interest of the investigation, this information is not to be disclosed. Brandon answered, though he'd love to answer the omnipresent reporter unceremoniously. If you know where the ring is, or Monica, let me know. The detective smiled. That phrase was unnecessary, too. Mr. Brent, how much could such a ring be worth? Another journalist blurted out, and the detective decided to take the opportunity to escape. 1000000. If it's real, he answered. Press conference over. God bless America and give us all strength. At this time, Mr. It was reading an article about himself, instantly covered in sweat. This journalist is, in fact, still a child, completely buried in the ground. Not even the top of his head sticking out. The kidnapping of his daughter was relegated to the back burner. Turns out, all of America is now talking about how the millionaire is the one who stole George Washington's ring. Angry comments flooded the newswires. Columnists, practicing their wit, tried to find more and more caustic language to denote his failure. Galliano, Mr. whispered it into the tube. Do I need you urgently? I'm on my way. Enthusiastically, the interlocutor replied. Galliano could smell money a mile away. Not every lawyer had such a nose. And not everyone knows how to interpret signals correctly. Today, when he first heard the ABM, Galliano scandalized and immediately canceled all business meetings, postponed them for a week ahead. He went to a restaurant near Mr. Matt's residence and waited for the call. When the driver drove him to the mansion, the lawyer asked him to stop at a newsstand. So he bought a fresh press, sat in the back seat of his Rolls-Royce, and flipped through the pages. Galliano loved the smell of freshly printed newspapers. It took him back to his childhood, when he himself had sold the same publications on the streets of New York for $2 a day. That's all in the past now. But the smell of the fresh press still lifts his spirits. On the front page, these pages of which should have been adorned with a picture of Joe's daughter, in a lavish dress, the headline Millionaire. Talman, how did the gentleman encroach on the history of the states? Galliano read the entire article and noted to himself that there was nothing to latch onto. The whole piece is built on innocent questions and official police reports. The first ring was indeed stolen. The second Mr. confirmed that the relic went through his hairy hands. About the excessive vegetation. It's completely true. All mature Italians suffer from this scourge. The third daughter of a millionaire is missing, and the day before he gave her the rings. As they say, draw your own conclusions. The only thing that caught the eye of an experienced lawyer was the word clip ataman. Galliani knew very well that medical diagnosis should not be published on the pages of the press. And yet it wasn't enough to nail him and make him apologize. What about the smaller news sites that reprinted the news without looking into the details? It seems that by the evening, all America knew that it had something to do with disappearance of some national relic, and the public didn't want to know other details. They wanted hot facts. The lawyer walked through the beautiful courtyard with traces of the failed wedding. The staff of the entertainment agency dismantled the scenes, unwrapped the tables, reassembled the chairs. The guards, as if they were soldiers, covered every entrance and exit to Mr. It's mansion and to his guest house. Galliano nodded to one of them, whose face seemed familiar, but he didn't even see a smile in return. What caught his eye, though, was the automatic pistol that was loaded, placed in a holster. Not one that was being prepared for defense. A security guard demanded a pass. The gentleman is waiting for me, the lawyer explained, showing his card. Tell me that Galliat is not in place. Stand by. The guard ordered and ran to his patron. That one will always be so strict now, thought Galliani, looking around. The The guards cast unkind glances at him, and when one of the employees dismantled the scene, approached the mansion, almost beat him. "Where are you going?" angrily asked the hot young man. "Why are you here, Stinky?" "I was looking for the bathroom," whispered the employee. "What is it? A wedding or a funeral?" Rodriguez shouted. The security guard kicked this underdog out and blacklisted him. "But I didn't do anything," screamed the unhappy entertainment agency employee. "Let me get my things together." "You'll get it in the mail," Rodriguez replied. "You're right, the right to live is main entrance. Walk quickly, or I'll give you the acceleration." Galliani, who had been to this hospitable house at the best of times, never ceased to be amazed. First of all, he could not believe that Giuseppe had enemies capable of stealing his daughter for God's sake. This is America. Here all matters can be settled in court. Secondly, Galliano had never noticed so many guards. With his experienced eye, he counted 15 men. From whom was he going to defend himself? "Mr. Galliani," the first guard called him, returning from his patron. "Mr. Joe is waiting for you in the library on the second floor. He said you would find your own way." "Certainly." The lawyer nodded and walked past the armed guys. Peaceful man. He hated it when they tried to settle things with guns. The tables inside the house had not yet been dismantled. Snacks and drinks were still on them. And Galliano couldn't resist tasting some black caviar cookies. A compact refrigerator in the cupboard was set up for the delicacy. All the lawyer had to do was to lift the lid and put the delicacy with a silver spoon. He adored a good meal. That's why so many culinary masterpieces made his eyes scatter. Even the sandwich. He went up to the second floor and saw the master of the house. The gentleman was hard to look at. This big, strong man literally stuck his neck out. There were bags under his eyes. He was also wiping sweat from his forehead. Galliano approached him and shook his hand warmly. And then they embraced. "I'm sorry, friend, we said that. I'm sorry I didn't invite you to my daughter's wedding." "It was nothing," the lawyer said. "I guess you've had your hands full with old friends. Besides, I was supposed to have an important meeting this evening, but I canceled it." "I'm in trouble," said the millionaire. As if you did not hear him. "You must have heard that my daughter is missing." "Of course I did." Galliani nodded. "I wanted to tell you from the start that all negotiations should be conducted by the police. Alas, criminals are harder to negotiate with than the most hardened bigwigs." "No calls yet," Mata sighed. "I called you in on another matter. They can't make a formal charge." The lawyer nodded. He was all too aware of the consequences that might ensue if the story of this ancient ring did get untwisted. "We might be arrested, not for a token 6 months, but for a serious term. This story about the Washington ring is a nightmare." Mentioned Galliani. "You were right to call me. You can go to jail for stealing such a thing. A man with Italian roots, of course." "But I didn't know that," shouted Giuseppe. "Damn it. There have been so many presidents in the history of this glorious country. How am I supposed to know a ring was stolen?" "Take it easy. Joe, calm down," whispered Galliano's lawyer. "I've pulled you out of the liquid mud before. And this time I ask you to say one thing. Keep your voice down." "That's it," said Joe, lowering his voice by half, even more quietly. The lawyer asked. Through his channels, he learned that a journalist had entered the house under the guise of a waitress. Of course, letting that many people into his mansion was a huge risk. If he had consulted Galliani, he would have immediately said, "Celebrate the wedding should be anywhere, but not here. Away from the walls." Now he had to be careful. Suddenly another left-wing journalist overhears them. "What's up?" whispered the millionaire. "Yes, perfectly," agreed Galliano. "Tell me, have you been questioned?" "No," answered this. "There was a conversation with a detective, that's all. The same conversation that this journalist overheard. You see, you have to give a normal testimony." The lawyer advised it. "Say you were looking for a present for your daughter, and some adventurer offered you a Martha Washington ring. And out of sheer humor, you bought it as a joke, thinking you were getting some face everywhere, not an heirloom. How much did you pay?" 100,000, answered. "We're 100 grand. Galliani shouted. "Oh, shit. No, that won't do. You paid a 10 or a tenner? You got it? Okay, nodded the millionaire. "The main thing is not to forget. Do you think I'll go to jail?" "If you listen to me, no," the lawyer shrugged his shoulders. "When you were summoned for questioning. Tomorrow, at 2:00 p.m., said we'll go together." "You ask," Gagliano chuckled. "Now you don't even piss without your lawyer." There's a way to get you off the hook and even make you a hero." "How?" asked Matt. He was willing to pay more than Galliano's fabulously expensive fees. "Find the ring." The lawyer shrugged. "Do you really think these half-wits can find your daughter?" "All rich people are the same," Brandon thought. Not 2 hours later, the millionaire called an incredibly expensive lawyer to pretend to solve his issues. And now this parasite from the legal world was calling his detective's private phone. How did he get the number? Of course, you'd have to talk to someone like that. Like it or not, there wasn't much of a desire. Mr. Brandon said to Galliani with a smile as he began the video call. "I apologize for the distraction. My client and I would like to assist the investigation." "I'm listening." The detective answered only quickly and to the point. "We're still looking for Monica." That's just what Mr. Joy had a few words to say about. The lawyer smiled. He turned the cameras over to the millionaire. "Mr. It's like an older man stuck it out. Detective." Brandon grinned gloatingly to himself. The rich cry too. No, they weep when it becomes obvious that something cannot be bought with money. Like going back in time and righting wrongs. "Detective," said it, but his voice sounded rusty. "Martha Washington's ring, or rather, allegedly Martha's ring, that is, allegedly Martha's ring." Alleged ring. "Stop wasting my time." Brandon exploded. "We're off the record here. Anyway, it's a Dan ring. 2 guys brought it to me," said the millionaire. "Tom, the former head of security, set me up with them. I fired him today." Brandon is used to his clients not telling the truth. But when it comes to his daughter, maybe if he'd gotten this information a few hours ago, the investigation would have moved forward by now. The Brand sighed and pointed his tongues, singing indignation within himself. Already something he said. "What were their names?" "I really don't know the names of these people," Matt said. "Real names. We have to remember something," Brendan exhorted him. "They probably know the fate of the ring and your daughter. I saw them for the first time." The millionaire answered. "Didn't write the volume. He said some people wanted to sell me something worthwhile. I don't know why I agreed to this stupid meeting. In fact, it was not exactly like that." There, the head of security said that the real relic of Martha Washington's ring had surfaced on the black market. And already Mr. Matt himself begged to arrange a meeting and sell the thing. He somehow thought that if his daughter will wear such a ring, not a single person in the whole country would not dare to challenge his status as a citizen of the United States. One of them was named Rick, pronounced "We are Thin Rick," Brendan exclaimed. He couldn't hide his excitement. "Did you really mess with Thin Rick?" The detective found it increasingly difficult to refrain from the very, very unprintable expressions for which his department was famous. To think thin. That man certainly wouldn't miss an opportunity to make a big score. And if we also showed him the money? Now I understand why the kidnappers made no demands. They could wait a few days. Playing a subtle game with a millionaire. That's all. Brandon asked. Or are there any other juicy details? That's it. Exhaled the millionaire. "Please find my daughter." The lawyer again turned the camera to his pretty face. The detective noted to himself that this man did not care about other people's suffering. He didn't even change his face when he asked him to find his daughter. And the name of the Thin Rick made exactly no impression on him. "It will facilitate the investigation officers, won't it?" Galliano asked. "Certainly," answered Brendan. "I shall report everything to the prosecutor." That's all. Galliano said he would stay at Matt's mansion as long as necessary. The millionaire thanked him for his concern, although he did not believe in its sincerity. However, the presence of the old acquaintance was very opportune. Mr. Joe now could not relax for a moment and waited for new blows. Leaving aside the Italian wine, the master ordered to serve him a bottle of whiskey. He began to drink this drink to recover a little, and at the same time to calculate the losses. So if his daughter's wedding had not taken place, that meant that he could forget about reaching new financial milestones. Converting influence into square kilometers of offices and residential apartments is not possible. Speaking of influence, after a series of articles in defeat, Mr. Mata will be avoided as if he were a leper. He has already seen it here in the West. Such ostracism has been called culture abolition. Fortunately for him, he doesn't have to get roles in movies or seek contact with the crowd. So he can just leave managerial positions formally and go into the shadows, and from there continue pulling the strings. Finally, the most important attack is the risk of ending up behind bars. This blamed himself for having told the detectives about the ring without consulting Galliano. That this whole game was played by professionals was beyond doubt. First, they forced him to buy the ring, taking advantage of his provincial complexes. Then they sent some actress in the guise of an old woman. They set it up on purpose so that he would kick her out, but remember her name. And then they kidnapped his daughter. The problem is that he, Giuseppe, is still at the mercy of unknown intruders, while he remains a piece on the chessboard. Those continue their game and will soon want the prize money, $10 million at least. That's when he'll show them what Italian integrity means. He'll agree to any demands, find the money, and then the flywheel will spin. No man will get away with what he will do to them. Oh, at this time, a gentleman who was very much inferior to us in volume and capital structure. Likewise, he was drinking whiskey on the same occasion. But unlike Mr. Joe, he was celebrating success, not counting losses. In just 2 moves, not just to humiliate his opponent, but to destroy him. Of course, not everything went exactly as the calculating Italian had planned. Some things had to be corrected on the fly. But revenge, the very dish that should be served cold, turned out to be really juicy. Reading the headlines and the angry comments, Cutthese reveled in his victory. The only question that kept him busy was, where had the girl gone? He really thought about her kidnapping. He kept the possibility in his mind all the time and even embedded his man in the entourage. But these fools couldn't prove anything anyway. And so Mr. Elizabeth had only to sing to the whiskey, eating pickled olives and laughing, rejoicing in his genius plan. He would find the girl. Wouldn't someone who was playing his own game interfere with this story, would he? The clock ticked past 12. Stanley and Brendan continued to sit in the office, analyzing information. The kidnapping required complete concentration, for the clock was ticking. At such moments of peak seat note, one descends to the bottom of Maslow's pyramid of needs. After a week at the Real, Stanley was willing to sell his soul for a hot shower and a bed of fresh linens. It is for this reason that he quits. And Brandon, it seems, could endure any hardship not a man, but a machine. He held a complex dialogue with 3 informants at once. This work resembled a chess game with several opponents at once. And Brenton approached the denouement, moved into the endgame. He was about to checkmate and checkmate at the same time. Bingo, shouted the detective. I found her. Found who? Surprised Stanley. Our girl. Brandon answered. It's going to cost me a lot, though, but that's all right. Come on, let's get to the transport. We'll get her. Just the 2 of us? Stanley asked. Are you crazy? Let's call in a SWAT team for force support. I've got 2 bulletproof vests in the trunk, Brendan shrugged, and a shotgun. You can take the helmet if you want. I'm not going anywhere, Stanley cut him off. I've already dropped a request for support from the mine. Brandon smiled. Or I'll go alone. With those words, he threw his jacket over his shoulders and rushed out the door. Stanley cursed, put his hat on his head, and ran after him. Brandon, despite his build, moved very legally. Stanley rushed after him on his long legs, cursing his partner. Where did the information even come from? He asked. And what's the rush? From an informant. Brandon answered. We've got about 20 minutes tops. The detectives drove through the city at night, both the Buick and Brendan literally devouring the miles. He sped up to an absolutely obscene speed, and Stanley prayed they wouldn't crash into some pole or manhole. Where are we going so fast? Stanley asked. Let's go easy on the warehouses, Brendan answered. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed his partner patting himself in his pockets. Did you forget your phone? Yeah, nodded Stanley. "Oh shit, it's all your fault. While we were running up the stairs, I dropped the boss," Brandon replied. "Didn't you get Churko off in time?" Stanley was silent. They drove into some kind of industrial development. In the dark, the detective still couldn't recognize the place. Brandon turned off the engine. Quietly, without slamming the doors, they approached the trunk. Brandon handed him, "Did we come here with a girl or for what?" "For the girl," Brandon answered, smiling slyly. "We're looking for Warehouse 48. That's what the informant said." Out of the corner of his eye, Brandon saw Stanley slam his pocket again to get his phone. The detective smiled. "That's how it is, you live. You talk to a man for years, and he's a two-faced rat, and he's willing to sell you out for not just 30 coins, or something even cheaper. You're the one who told the river where we're going to torture our millionaire, aren't you?" Brandon continued, filling a shotgun with ammunition. "She never would have guessed it herself." "Go to hell," said Stanley. "I didn't do anything, and you hid my phone." "You didn't?" "No." Brandon smiled, adjusting his armor, which barely fit his big belly. "Just put it in a drawer so you'd forget it." "Now what?" asked Stanley. "Gonna turn me in with my guts?" "No, worse." My partner answered. "Let's find the girl. I'll write a report and go back to your corrupt journalists." He spectacularly jerked the bolt, filling the cartridge into the snick, though the movement was unnecessary. Brandon already knew he wouldn't have to shoot, but he wanted to impress Stanley and show what a beautiful world he was losing. Instead of fried facts, real male friendship instead of stray coins, something more expensive, a sense of mutual support and respect. "Follow me," Brandon ordered, turning on the flashlight on his shotgun. Together, they stole from the underground level. Warehouse 48 wasn't hard to find. A streak of light poked out from under the door, and someone was playing music inside. A great place to rehearse. No one was around at this time of day. The nearest houses were a few miles away. Approaching closer and closer to the cherished warehouse, Brandon began to worry that the informant had deceived him. He could hear the gentle chiming of guitars and charming duets of male and female voices. Stanley fell behind. What a rat, thought Brendan hadn't even left yet, and already he was getting so bent out of shape about his own ass. The detective crept up to the steel door and slipped his finger into the gap between them behind the word push and pull back. The door began to open slowly, as if a gust of wind had set it in motion. The voices fell silent. Brandon heard footsteps from the back of the warehouse. Someone was coming to close the door. It all made sense. And when a man's hand advanced in search of a handle, the detective nimble grabbed it, twisted it, and pulled it toward him. "Handcuffs." "Stan," shouted Brendan. "Stan, handcuffs. Damn you to hell." The clock read 8. Tough morning. Still getting up in bed yesterday. At this time, Mr. Mata thought he was ruler of the world. He had made plans. He was going to build up his capital to obscene levels. And today he is sitting in his underwear on a silk sheet, trying to grasp the shadow of the passing day. So first, let's calculate the losses. George Rossi called their longtime friendship a mistake and asked not to bother him anymore. Paul Bianchi publicly disavowed the multi-million-dollar contract. Giovanni Greca called to apologize and told for long 5 minutes why this conversation will be the last. Luca Moretti even ordered a column in 5 leading coastal media outlets at once to angrily denounce his former business partner. That is, of all mortal sins. But he did not have the most pleasant conversation with Mr. Rinaldi yesterday. Add to this a dozen of other, not financial sharks, but smaller fish, which yesterday rushed away from him. Yeah, it's time to declare bankruptcy. No, he's got some savings. Enough to live a comfortable life. Enough to travel. Of all the guards, we'll have to leave 2 or 3 men before the secretary. It's a girl with a funny name, Alesh. He liked it. Just make sure she doesn't rush out now to tell the media about harassment. No, she wasn't. But the biggest loss was Monica, his daughter, his most important treasure. Still out of reach. What if the mysterious kidnappers found out what relic he gave her and thought the ransom was a lie, or now they want to spin him for a sum he simply doesn't have? There was another possibility. Even if it was a slim chance the daughter had been found, They were just too embarrassed to call early in the morning or didn't want to break the terrible news. Mr. This remembered that Detective Brenton had left his phone number and urged him to call at almost any time of the day or night. Well, 800 a.m. was a legitimate time to get in touch. He dialed the number. The policeman answered the phone the same second. "Did you find my daughter?" Without a preamble, Mr. Matt asked. In just one day, he had lost so much of what he held dear. "Yes," answered Brandon. Briefly. "Found." "Then why?" whispered Mida. "Why didn't you call?" "At 200 hours you came in for questioning." The detective stretched out lazily. "That's when you find out. She is alive," frightenedly asked the millionaire. "Fortunately, yes," replied the detective. No more comments on the phone. In the receiver sounded, the connection interrupted. It threw the expensive phone into the wall in a rage. The iPhone bounced on the floorboards and jumped several times like a frog. The screen was covered with a network of cracks. He shouted and came running toward me. When the frightened girl ran into the bedroom, he said, "Call that rascal. Call right now. Although wait. Call him. Call him in a few minutes. Come here, honey, I've got something to do." "I'm listening," said Mr. "If I find out it was you who hissed, it's if I find out it's me," calmly replied the nemesis me. "Who else was ever going to hear anybody? If you call me, don't play games with me, you kidnapped my daughter," said the millionaire angrily. "You planted that ring on me, but you're like a child. I'm not going to be frank with you over the phone," he grinned. "Unlike you, Joe, I know all too well what kind of cells a talkative businessman gets into. If I find out it was you who hissed it, that you're the one who set it up, oh my God, you really don't know anything." Surprised as a result, "No," Joe answered. He was confused, and about my nephew too. Asked the vis-a-vis. "No, but then go quickly to the main entrance of your pseudo-American mansion. Let's run before it's too late." And he hung up. We thought it would be downright Italian to shoot him when he was left alone unguarded in such an open place. But he was no longer afraid of death. Why would he want a world without his daughter? And also capital, which is what made a descendant of immigrants with a last name. It was Mr. Staggering. He strode across the courtyard of his mansion. After last night's invasion of wedding guests, the place had not yet been properly cleaned. There were napkins, plastic bottles, leftover crockery, and engraved spoons lying around. The jam he'd ordered the day before. The guards looked away and pretended to be extremely busy bums. So he reached the main entrance of his estate, swung open the entrance gate, spread his arms out to shout, "Well, I'm all yours now." But there was no minibus, not even a scooter where a machine gunner could sit. Only on the grass in front of the gate lay a small box. He picked it up and put it in his pocket, though it might well have been a bomb. He went back into the house, sat down on the sofa, opened it. In the box was his daughter's ring, or rather Martha's ring to Washington, and a small letter. The millionaire unwrapped it and read it aloud. "And no one kidnapped me. I'm fine. And I'm happy. P.S. Go to hell, bye."